All right, welcome back. We're going to talk about Chapter 2 next. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the little bar at the bottom, which I'm sure you find annoying. And let's talk about Chapter 2, which gets into compliance with respect to law and ethics. Okay, so we're going to cover this chapter. I'm going to cover material that's in the book, but I'm also going to freelance a few things that are related to this chapter, okay, that are a little bit newer than what's in the book. So let's start off with information security professionals. If you're an information security professional, you're entrusted with protecting the crown jewels, so to speak, of an organization. And so you have to have the highest ethical and moral standards. Okay? And there are plenty of examples of security professionals who didn't have the highest ethical and moral standards. But if this is the field you plan to go into eventually, it's absolutely critical that you have the highest ethical and moral standards. Okay. So let's talk about ethics a bit in the context of this field. So we think about things that are right or wrong. What do others think is right or wrong? And then how do we use ethics in practice? And so to start off with, I'll just mention that on page 69 of the book, there's a bit of an article about ethics in information systems. Okay, you definitely should read that little article, which is about 2 pages. But it covers the 10 commandments of computer ethics. Okay, you don't need to memorize things for this class in general, but I would memorize those commandments. Okay, they'll serve you well in your career. All right, ethics education. When we do ethics education, we do training on expected behaviors. We use practical scenarios, and we do this to raise awareness. So an example you might see, and some companies are, by the way, better at this than others. Some companies do a great job of doing their training using real practical scenarios as opposed to far-fetched scenarios that would never happen. Okay, I just did some training last year that was phenomenal. It didn't come from the university; it was from my employer, but very practical scenarios around information security and ethics. Okay, so this is a key point to take away when you develop your set of materials for your homework and or your project. You certainly want to consider practical education scenarios, not just hypothetical scenarios. Okay? So to give you an example of what students in a previous version of this class did, they actually did shoulder surfing training, right? They did malicious person internally shoulder surfing to get information about other people's passwords and usernames and things like that. Okay, that's the type of education that's effective. You use something that's a real life scenario. Another example that was used in a previous class, actually by the same group, was they actually put up phishing websites. Okay, one of them owned a domain name and did this. And they did it to prove how easy it is to do phishing. So they put together training and they had their peers send them a phishing email with a fake link, which they knew it was a fake link, but they played along and it collected information. Okay, you could do something along those lines. What you should not do in those exercises in this class is just put together a PowerPoint and walk through the PowerPoint. That is not very educational. Okay. So I don't even like to use PowerPoints. So you'll notice as we progress through the class, the first few weeks, there's some PowerPoints. And then I am weaning you off from the PowerPoints. So by week 4, that'll be the end of the PowerPoints for this class. Okay? There is no test, so you don't need the PowerPoints for a test. All right. PowerPoints are not a great way to learn. And so if anybody submits their set of assignments with PowerPoints and just reading them, you're not going to be happy with your score. Okay, So make sure you be creative about the way that you do education. Okay, think of ways to really actually educate people. Deterrence. So we use deterrence to prevent unwanted behaviors by threatening punishment. Okay, so we fear of being terminated. We have a fear of a warning or going to jail or something like that. Okay, so we use that to deter unwanted behaviors. Okay, in order for a deterrent to be effective, there has to be a high probability of getting caught and a high probability of the penalty being applied, and there has to be a penalty with teeth. Okay, so as an example, actually, let's use the federal government as an example. If you were to break into a federal government system, there's the threat of going to prison. Okay, and we're not talking some, minimum security prison, where you get conjugal visits or whatever. We're talking about, that was an Office Space reference, by the way. Okay, we're talking white collar crime prison, where you are going to be put in with the general population, for many years, for that sort of thing. So we have to have a fear penalty. Knowing that we have monitoring of systems, has a high probability of being caught. And if you get caught, seeing conviction rates, being very high when you have evidence like that, you have a high probability of being penalized for that. Okay, so as an organization, if we say we're going to do something, then we had better follow through with it. Okay. Another thing to mention, we'll get into this a bit more later, is you can't have a policy in an organization that applies only to the worker bees and not to the executives. Okay. If you did something like that would not actually protect you as an organization from any legal implications of that. So the CEO is held to the exact same standard as anybody else in the organization. Okay, and if your organization doesn't do that and give special treatment, then guess what? You could find yourself in a lot of trouble. Information security responsibilities. So their responsibility is to deter people from committing unethical and illegal acts. And they do this with policy. The policy needs to have teeth, so punishment associated with the policy, education, training, and awareness, and then the proper controls in place. Okay? So what are the categories of unethical behavior? There can be ignorance, accidental, or intent. Okay? So how do we deter unethical behavior? Well, we use set of programs, and we can also use policies and procedures, again, assuming we have strong consequences if that behavior occurs. Okay? So our deterrence criteria is the fear of getting caught, the probability of getting caught, and the probability of penalty, coupled with that penalty being severe enough. Okay? So the effectiveness of deterrence, it's an implementation of all three criteria. Okay? So most organizations that professionals belong to have a code of conduct. Okay, so let's use a few examples. Number one, the American Medical Association has a code of conduct for physicians and other doctors. Okay, that a violation of that code of conduct can mean a loss of their certification or their membership. In that case, their certification or membership could have economic impacts on them. Okay. So those types of professional organizations can influence professional behavior. I'll give you another one. Okay, another example. The American Bar Association, okay, or the California Bar Examiners. Okay. If you violate the codes of conduct, you can lose your license to practice law. And interestingly enough, there are actions being taken against Rudy Giuliani right now over his conduct, which potentially was, misconduct in terms of ethics and misconduct in terms of these codes of conduct, okay, as a professional. And so the New York State Bar Association is threatening to pull his membership. Okay? So there is some teeth behind these things. So some professional organizations, Association for Computing and Machinery. I don't think I remember right now. I think I forgot to renew it. But ACM is a membership organization that if you're an MIS major, it's one of the organizations you might consider joining. There's networking and a lot of really great information. They put out a really great magazine and other materials. Okay. If you are in the security organization, ISC2 is an organization, the SANS Institute, ISACA, and ISSA. Okay, those are all professional organizations that might apply. IEEE for engineers, you get the picture. Okay. So for InfoSec in the law, basic understanding of legal frameworks is required. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the legal system. Okay. So in the United States, a little different in other countries, but in the United States, we have the concept of constitutional law, and that is made up of the U.S. Constitution, state constitutions, which apply to the states that you live in, bylaws and charters and other subdivisions of states. Okay, so counties, cities, that sort of thing. Right? Statutory law, which is made by the legislative branch. Regulatory law, which is made by the executive branch in the form of regulatory agency regulations and executive orders. So the FAA, for example, has a regulatory and guidance library, and they make rules related to flying in airplanes. Okay, the FCC regulates communications. The FTC regulates commerce. So those agencies can do regulations as well. Then you have executive orders from the president. And then you have the common law. And the common law is what we have across the U.S. at a federal level as well as at a state level, except for one state. I know this is not a live lecture, but say it out loud anyways. What state does not use the common law? And we'll do the Jeopardy thing. Okay. It is Louisiana. Louisiana does not have a common law system. They're the only state in the U.S. with the Napoleonic Civil Code from France. Okay, so they use statutory law, which is also known as civil law, and that is from the French legal system. Common law is from the English legal system. Okay, so all other states use the common law, which means the judicial branch makes decisions. Okay, and so the judicial branch can make decisions that can override other laws. Okay? They can also interpret laws, and their decisions then lead to interpretation. Now, we'll talk about a couple of things related to law and security. Okay? I'm going to use an example that is fresh off the presses from 12 days ago now. Okay? Well, actually, not quite 12 days ago, but we'll say this all started 12 days ago. 12 days ago, we had a terrorist attack on the U.S. Capitol. Okay? You can sugarcoat it all you want, but the fact remains it's a terrorist attack, plain and simple. But as action after that terrorist attack, various organizations utilized their terms and services and things, because they're private entities, to eliminate accounts that they felt were a security threat to the U.S. or to individuals, okay, safety of individuals. And the first thing I started seeing from what those in the legal profession refer to as armchair lawyers is everybody coming out of the woodwork and saying, that's a violation of the Constitution. We have a First Amendment right to speech. The reality is those are private companies, and the First Amendment does not apply to them. Okay? The First Amendment freedom of speech that we all hear is only related to government actions. Okay, so the federal government wouldn't be able to tell Twitter to remove you from Twitter. Okay, there's some exceptions to that around safety and things like that, but generally speaking, the government cannot order that you be removed, right? But that's not to stop Twitter from doing so. Okay, so Twitter can determine that you're violating their terms and conditions and get rid of you. Okay? There's analogies you'll see. I'm not going to repeat them, but you can use the analogy to this of there was a Supreme Court decision where Hobby Lobby wanted to exclude birth control from their health care plan. Okay? And the Supreme Court ruled that they could do so. Okay? They're a private entity. They can do that sort of thing. It's very similar to that. It's very similar to if you own some sort of business and someone comes in and they just something about them is different than what you agree with. You could conceivably decide you don't want them in your place of business and say they're not allowed to come there anymore. Okay, it's not any different than any of that stuff. So why did I mention all that? Because that's a constitutional related law that can affect your ability to have privacy and security within your organization. Okay, so constitutional law is one type, right? You can have statutory laws that relate to the security and privacy of data. Okay, an example would be the Computer Fraud Access and Abuse Act, I believe it is. Okay, or the Communications Decency Act, incidentally, which is what keeps coming up. That we need to get rid of this section of the CDA because of free speech and that's a federal law that protects certain types of businesses for allowing you to have basically unfettered free speech. Okay, so by never censoring what you say on Facebook, Facebook gets that protection. Okay. Now that being said, if you violate their terms and conditions, they can stop you from saying certain things. They generally don't. They've actually done a pretty poor job at censorship. But they do have that right. Okay, the statutory law being things like the CDA, CFA, other laws related to that sort of stuff. Okay, regulatory law. So there can be regulations that get put forth. Net neutrality is an example of that, by the way. So the executive branch, in this case the FCC, ruled that net neutrality would be repealed. Okay. The president has some powers of executive orders, but some of his executive orders might be unconstitutional. And then common law, we have the judicial branch decisions. So there have been decisions against tech companies. Contrary to what you might read in the news, tech companies have been hit hard with decisions over the years. Okay, so there are a lot of decisions. I've got, just to give you an example, I have two big huge books back here. Okay, maybe even that third book, that are all about cases related to cyberspace. Okay, so if you can imagine, and those books are a lot older than they should be now, but there's been a lot of court cases around tech companies. Okay, all right, so let's move on to subdivision of laws, because it helps to have a primer of our legal system. So we have civil laws. Okay, and this is a different type of civil than what I was talking about earlier. When I was talking about civil before, I was talking about area of procedure. So there's procedural aspects of the law, and then there's the substantive areas of the law. So far, I was kind of talking about the substantive area of the law. Okay, now I'm going to talk a bit about procedure and then the areas that go within there. So within civil procedures of the court systems, we have contracts. So contract law, employment, torts. Torts are a private action that's similar to criminal law, but it's righting wrongs privately. Okay, so the O.J. Simpson trial is a great example. Okay, there's a civil trial and there's a criminal trial. Okay, the criminal trial, I'll get to that in a second. Actually, let's start with civil. With a civil action, anybody can take a private action against someone else if they have standing to do so. Okay, so if in the O.J. Simpson trial, the families of his wife and the other folks involved could bring a private civil action against O.J. Simpson for a tort of bodily harm or something like those lines. Trespass to their land, whatever it might be, as a tort. Negligent infliction of emotional distress, intentional infliction of emotional distress, that sort of thing. False imprisonment. Okay. Then there's family law, which fits into civil law. So this is divorce and prenuptials and child custody and all those sorts of things. Okay, so that all fits into civil. Then there's the criminal area, and criminal can only be brought by a government. Okay, so you can't file criminal charges against anyone else. And I'm going to say this just because this is a big problem that comes up, and it's related to this class. Okay, every single day I get a phone call from, wouldn't you know it, my same area code and phone number. Okay, threatening me with legal action and that they're going to come arrest me, okay, over something. And usually it's, claiming to be the IRS or something like that, right? Or it's, a private company trying to claim that against someone else. Okay? No one can file criminal charges against you except for a federal, state, or local government. Period. Okay? Joe Schmo can't file a criminal case against you. Now, you can commit a crime and they can press charges, but only that prosecution arm of the government can actually prosecute you and file a criminal action. Okay? At most, you as an individual can decide that you want to press charges against another individual. But the prosecution is only going to do that if there's sufficient evidence to justify that. Okay? So criminal laws can apply to security-related matters as well. Okay, like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Okay, that one is an area where you access a system without authorization. That could be hacking. Okay, or if you have authorized access and you exceed your authorized access, then you could be prosecuted under that as well. Okay, there have been people permanently banned from using any type of electronic device by the government because they were teenagers and they decided to hack into systems. Okay. Can you imagine going your whole life without ever being able to use any type of electronic device, especially in this day and age, right? Then you can have public laws and private laws. So public laws regulate what the government entities and their relationships with individuals and other governments can do. Okay. Private laws, those regulate the interactions between individuals and organizations. Okay. So we can have different types of laws. Now, in the book, there are tons of laws in a table, and I'm not going to go through them all. I've mentioned a few of them already. Okay? But 80 through 84 has a table with a ton of different information security related laws. You should take a look at them. Okay? You don't need to memorize them, but you should at least have some familiarity with them because they may be required as part of your project. Now, moving on, NIST. NIST is a government agency, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and they guide several areas. Standards for computer systems, guidelines for computer systems in the federal and state governments, standards for security and privacy, security awareness guidelines, and then validation procedures for how secure you are. If you've never gone to the NIST website, you should do so and take a look around. Okay. Now, this is an area where I do a lot of things, so if you have questions in this area, please feel free to ask. Okay. I work with NIST quite extensively. In fact, I'm working on a project with them right now that could be really interesting and using a tool that they've recently developed and they're getting ready to release. So they do FISMA, FedRAMP. These are required federal standards for information security. If you want to work in a government agency, you should probably get familiar with FISMA and FedRAMP. Okay. FISMA being just in general for security, FedRAMP being for cloud-based systems. Okay. There's a common misunderstanding there from people that if it's any type of software, then it has to be FedRAMP. FedRAMP is for cloud-based solutions only. Okay. If I want to FedRAMP my CD that I have Office on and I want to get that FedRAMP, I can't get that FedRAMP. Okay. I can make sure that my computer meets FISMA standards and any software installed meets FISMA standards, but I can't make my computer with a CD and it be FedRAMP compliant. Okay. It's not a cloud-based system. All right. There are some other NIST standards as well. So there are things that are for higher security environments, like DoD, that NIST pushes out, and then the DoD and intelligence community go and change it up for their specific needs. Okay. There are federal privacy laws, but they're not what you think. Okay. There are no breach laws at the federal level. Okay. The privacy laws at the federal level are extremely limited. So, for example, when you hear the Privacy Act, okay, in the context of the federal government, well, that is government use of private information, and that's it. Okay. There's the there wiretapping statutes, there are internet privacy rules that were established but struck down by Congress. There's HIPAA, which is important and affects all of us. That's healthcare only, though. There is copyright law. There's the Freedom of Information Act. There's Sarbanes-Oxley. If you're an accounting person, SOX is going to be important. Even for us IT people, it's important. And then states have their own breach laws. Okay, so there's a CCPA in California. There's also a replacement for the California Consumer Privacy Act. I'm not sure when it takes effect. I would imagine it's probably in January of next year, but I'm not certain on that. And then there's the GDPR for the European Union. And then you can track new laws here on this website. Okay. Other things that are related, Digital Millennium Copyright Act, DMCA. This makes it illegal for you to try to counteract copyright protection. So copying a DVD requires you to break the copyright encryption mechanism that's used for copyright protection. So if you duplicate a DVD or a Blu-ray, even if you can do it, you shouldn't do it because you're violating the DMCA. You could go to jail. Okay? Not to mention that the owner of that copyrighted item can go after you for a tort, okay, or other legal mechanisms like contract law if you bought it and through them and stuff. There's also the Australian High-Tech Crime Act. Okay, so there's some examples there. There are also industry standards. These are voluntary in some regards, but if you don't comply with them, you're on the hook for damages. So if you process credit cards and you don't use a service that is PCI compliant and you have PCI data on your own systems, guess what? You better be hoping that you're compliant with PCI because the penalties for that are severe. You'd probably be out of business, which is why a lot of organizations use something like Stripe or Square or PayPal or something that has that PCI layer. Policies, they're written like laws, but when you write policies, your ignorance of laws is not an excuse. So you can't be ignorant of laws. You should get legal advice from an attorney. Speaking of which, I can't give you any advice about how to interpret the laws in this class. If you have some hypothetical for your employer or something, you need to talk to a lawyer about it. Pure and simple. Okay? Ignorance of policy can be a defense, but policies must be distributed to everybody who's expected to comply. They have to be read and understood by all employees. It's good to have them signed off that you acknowledge them. Okay? Translations into different languages if they apply to your environment. They have to be accessible for disabled employees. They have to be acknowledged by the employee, usually use a consent form. And you have to enforce them across the board. No special treatment to the CEO or the brother of the CEO. Okay? If you adhere to all of the above, then the penalties are probably enforceable without a lawsuit. Okay? Liability. So liability may apply even if no laws are broken. Okay? So you must exercise due care and diligence and make sure that there's jurisdiction for the liability. Okay. Jurisdiction being what laws specifically apply in a situation. So if you guys should be careful when you sign contracts, and this is why vendor contracts typically have to be reviewed by legal and or your security department. So these days it's not uncommon to see both your legal and your security team simultaneously looking at terms and conditions for software that you might buy or a vendor contract. And so security is looking at it from a data, privacy, governance, and security perspective. Legal's looking at it from a legal liability perspective. So legal's going to look at what law applies. So when you look at any type of contract, it says, the laws of California apply, or the laws in New York in Nassau County apply, that sort of thing. Okay. And so you have several choices as to where those laws that apply can be. You're not allowed to forum shop, doesn't mean people don't try to do it. But if I'm based in California, I'm incorporated in California, and the other party's based in California and incorporated in California, then we really don't have any choice. Our laws of California will govern. Okay? But if I'm incorporated in Delaware and I live and work in California, and the other party lives and works in California, but they're incorporated in Texas, then potentially Delaware, Texas, or California are all in play. Okay? So you want to be careful. Obviously, it's in your best interest to have the forum as close as possible to you and as far away from the other party's jurisdiction. Okay? Now, another thing that can happen is you can have a disclaimer in the contract where you basically say, if there's a conflict between laws of different states, these laws apply, and we're going to ignore any conflict of laws that occur in any particular state. Okay. Law enforcement actions, you should look at pages 105 to 108. Okay. And that talks about the different law enforcement agencies and how things like forensics are handled. Okay. And then e-discovery, so very important. For security folks in particular, there's the forensic side of things, being able to go back and look at what happened, but there's also e-discovery. So if you're subject to e-discovery, everything gets put on hold. Okay, you're not allowed to delete it. You're not allowed to do anything with it. I've been subject to it before because of past employers. They've done something, and then everybody in the company is subject to it. It's not fun, okay? And it's serious stuff. There's a joke related to the Enron scandal that went around of something like, "Hey, I said save the documents for the feds, not rip them to shreds." Okay, if you destroy evidence, you can go to prison. Okay, so it doesn't matter if your boss tells you to shred something or whatnot. You don't want to destroy it. Okay. Now, companies put fail-safes in place to protect data. They also have retention policies for this reason. Okay. So they'll have different standard policies for the data and how it's going to be retained. Now, e-discovery allows you to go and discover data that's on hard drives and things like that and collect that information and pull it together for a lawsuit. So e-discovery is an area that has become very popular with the amount of electronic information that we produce. Okay? So that's it for this particular unit.